Hi, everyone. We'll do a good morning. It's delightful to see you all here. We'll do a microphone check by introducing ourselves. I think I can hear my microphone. So my name is Anne Delahanty, and I'm in the French department, and I also teach in Humanities 110. I've been at Reed since 2000.
Hi, I'm Chris Anderson. I'm in the psychology department. I have been here since 2007.
And I'm Anand Vedya. I teach in the anthropology department, and I've been here since 2018.
So it is, as I said, great to see you, and it's great to talk about things. This is the very practical session about choosing a major, learning about qualifying exams, and talking a little bit about the thesis. It's nice that there's not too many of you here, so we're going to leave a lot of time for questions in the hope that they will be generated. I'll just note that we all teach in very different disciplines, and we will try to speak as generally as possible. So sometimes it's hard for us to give you particulars about a very specific major, but we've been around the block a few times and usually can at least tell you where to find the information if you need it. So we're going to start with each of us giving a brief presentation about a different aspect of that process I just described. And then if we have anything to add from our relative disciplines or areas, we'll add it, and then we'll open it up to questions. So our presentations will be very brief, but we will start with Anand talking about choosing a major.
Great. So I was reflecting on sort of number of paths that a student might take as they choose a major. There's sort of all sorts of ways that you could decide on a major. You can come in with a passion for a topic. Environmental studies, I think, gets a lot of students who know that they're committed to the environment and they're looking for a way to match that with their academic career. A mode of study could be interesting to you, literary or mathematical, a type of performance, such as theater. Many students come in much less certain, and then they find over the course of the first couple of years that their talents and their interests really click with the discipline. And then, of course, there are many students who are planning ahead for medical school, for law school, for graduate school, and they're thinking about getting the requirements ready to apply for whatever comes ahead. All of these ways of choosing a major at Reed come together with what is, in my experience, I found is a fairly complicated curriculum where we attempt over a student's time at Reed, both to give them a wide breadth across disciplines, across what are called groups at Reed, within a sort of, within an area such as the humanities, or history and social sciences in my case. If a student's majoring in anthropology, they have to take a certain number of classes in political science, sociology, economics, history, and so on. And then within a discipline, we try to give them some breadth across the discipline, and then to focus them by the end of their time at Reed into really specializing enough to write a focused research paper, a thesis. Advisors and faculty are here to help students fit all this together. Their interests, their talents, what excites them, and the complicated curriculum. There's also a lot of resources online that you can look at with your children, with students. I recommend taking a look at on the registrar's website. There's a set of major planners that you can look at that go through what's required for each given major, because it's quite different from major to major. And it lets you kind of map out different options and see what fits together to accomplish a major. But there are 26 departments at Reed with 38 different majors. 13 of those are interdisciplinary across different departments, such as environmental studies, international comparative policy studies, biochemistry, and molecular biology. Then on top of that, there are 14 minors at Reed, which have a lower set of requirements each. Students can declare a major anytime after they've completed 13 units at Reed. This is typically at the end of their second years. They have to declare a major, I think, after they've finished 16 units. Some majors, that's when you have to declare it, but many students start thinking about their majors much earlier. Some majors, I think biochemistry and molecular biology, have to be started freshman year. So if a student wants to do that, they need to start going pretty quickly. Some of them have fewer requirements and they can be started a little bit later. Anthropology only has 7 units required in anthropology to get the major, so we often have students who start a little bit later. As students choose, I think it's useful to talk with as many people as possible, but in particular the professors in the department that you're thinking of, or that they are thinking of majoring in. It's a good idea always to go to office hours. Every professor has office hours. It's fine if you're not a student in that professor's class in a given semester. This happens to me all the time. A student will come by, say, I'm interested in anthropology. Can you tell me about the major? It's a good idea also, I think, to talk with other students who are majors in the department. They can give you a sense of what the life of the major is like, what it's like to be a student in that major, which professors are interesting for what topics. It's also a good idea to sort of participate in the life of the department, to go to lectures in the department, to go to other events, to hang out in the lounge. Every department has its own lounge that students spend time in. It's a good idea to talk about the range of jobs that Reed graduates who've majored in that have gone on to pursue. Possible internships, possible research opportunities that students can do while they're at Reed. Every department has students get involved in research to some extent. To find out what it's like to be a theater major or a physics major while you're at Reed, how it sets up your time at Reed, what these years here will be like, but also how it'll set up your time after Reed for whatever you want to pursue afterwards. Anything you'd add?
I would just add that it's not the worst thing in the world if the student is undecided at the beginning of sophomore year, so some of you do have sophomores still. And that really one thing an advisor can do, but also a parent can do this. So depending on how comfortable your kid is with talking to professors, and they should come talk to us. We are readily available, but I know I have a college freshman right now who is actually leery of going to talk to advisors. And what we did is these major planner forms can be really key. So the major planner forms lay out what's required, and if the kid is looking between, say, two different majors, you can look at what are the requirements. Are there some classes that might count for both? In which case, you can still be moving ahead prior to making up your mind. And so I think, at least in my case, a little combination of that got my kid, who is not a Reed student, but same idea, prepared to go talk to the advisor. So then the kid really had done the homework then, and I think the Reed major planner forms are extremely well done and really can help you get a very clear sense of what's required for the major. So sometimes the parent or guardian's role might be kind of to push towards some of those resources, to show the kid how to delineate the different options, to look at the kind of decision trees that have to occur. That's what we do as advisors all the time, but like I said, sometimes the getting into the office is an impediment for some of those kids. So sometimes you could push them a little bit in that direction. And then we love all our advisees, but at least my favorites are the ones who come in with their Excel spreadsheet and say, I've thought about these possibilities and these, what do you think? And that's a great situation. That's a great conversation that we love having.
Yeah, and I kind of feel obliged. Sorry, I'm going to take this off. So I sort of feel obliged. I also have a junior in college who happens to be a student. One of them is a student here at Reed. I will say as my job as a faculty mentor and advisor is to help your child find their pathway. Often students will come to me and say, my parents want me to major in this. All due respect, I do not listen to what your child's interpretation of your opinion. As a parent, I understand that is a different thing than what your opinion is. However, so a lot of that discussion is really what's your passion, right? What excites you? For students who come in and they don't really have a major, which I think is lovely, that's why we're a liberal arts college. It's a smorgasbord. You get to try everything. In a lot of ways, it's, what gets you excited, right? What can you foresee yourself doing with this major? So a lot of that discussion is around where their interests lie. And sometimes students say, well, I kind of like this and I kind of like that. So it's the way the groups are set up. It's like, okay, then let's explore that, right? You don't have to come in with a major in mind. The whole idea of a liberal arts education is that you get to explore different things. And we want to encourage them to do that. And even for us in the sciences, where often our majors are a little bit more in lockstep in terms of what you have to take at a certain time, we want them to be exploring what's happening in history and social sciences, what's happening in the humanities. Because you know what? Sometimes students get partway through their sophomore year. I just had a conversation on Friday with a student. I really thought I wanted to be a psychology major, but this is not for me. And I said, okay, what is interesting to you? And we talked about ways that they could pursue their interest in the humanities. Well, could I do an interdisciplinary major? Let's talk about that. So just kind of as that note, our focus is on your child and what they're looking to do.
Yes, thank you for adding that. And do you want to add anything else?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk briefly about the qualifying exam. So then once your student has declared a major, then they're part of that department. And the next hurdle that they have to cover or get over is the qualifying exam. And it's usually called the junior qualifying exam because it's taken during the junior year. For those of you who maybe have some experience with graduate school, this kind of is like a little mini graduate school model where you do the qualifying exam and then it gets you past that in order to get to write the thesis. However, it is in no means as psychologically damaging as my qualifying exams were. So I'll just put that aside. I'm kidding. They were fine, but still they were nothing like this. So the qualifying exams really vary from department to department, and every department on their website will describe what it is. The range of kinds of things it can be is it could be an examination, so a sort of content-based exam that takes place over a weekend. It can be a paper that you have to write. It can be reading a research paper and then needing to comment on that. In comparative literature, for instance, we have a week-long set of essays that you write based on a topic that you're kind of thinking about for your thesis. In most cases, and my colleagues can agree or disagree with me, I think the idea is it kind of is making sure both that you're prepared to do a thesis, but also that you kind of know what the expectations are in the major. So it's a rite of passage. It is not necessarily one that students should drop everything for. I mean, it's not part of a class usually, and so it becomes a little extra work during the junior year, so that does add stress to them. But we try to contain the stress, so we contain it into a weekend or a week to the extent that that's possible. You can take it more than once. You can fail the qualifying exam twice in a major, up to twice, right? After twice, the second time you can't major in that major. But really, that is relatively rare. For students who are studying abroad, if you wanted to go abroad during the spring semester of your junior year, that's still okay. We have provisions either, in some cases now, to take it because of everything being so readily available online. Sometimes you can take it online when you're abroad. In other cases, you can just take it in August prior to the beginning of your senior year. You can't start the thesis, however, until you have passed the qualifying exam. So that is a required step. I think that, I'm not going to go into the details of all the qualifying exams, but at least in the domains that I'm in, all of the students find them to be stressful but enriching. And so I think that's the idea, is that it's kind of a combination of the two. And so it adds a little bit of stress, but once they make it past that hurdle, then they're all set to write the senior thesis. So I'll let my colleagues add if there's anything else they want to add about that.
Yeah, I would say in anthropology, the idea is to allow students to revisit some of the fundamental questions in the discipline, to think through the history of the discipline and it's sort of its larger conceptual debates as they get ready to specialize in a thesis. So ideally, it works out to sort of help them step back from all the more specific classes they've taken as they get ready to plunge into something for the thesis.
And for those of us in the sciences, I think fairly typically, and it's in my department in psychology, what we're asking them to do is to demonstrate the skills necessary to be successful in thesis. So in our case, they have to decode a source article that's assigned and then propose the follow-up research study, an empirical study. And that's basically what a very mini portion over a weekend of what we would expect them to do in thesis. That said, though, it is a representation of what we've been training them to do since their very first year, in their very first class. I think we're very mindful of thinking about how do we get to thesis starting at first year and making sure they have the requisite skills. So the junior qual is really what's the culmination of your study over these 3 years to show us that you're ready to do this.
And then the last step of getting out of this institution is the senior thesis.
I'd just like to say, as a faculty member, this is my favorite part of my job. To see students really, in some cases, surpass themselves, right? You can have students who have been in your classes and you've enjoyed being with them, and they hit thesis and just something magical happens. Now, I'm not going to say magic doesn't always happen, but I think more often than not it does. You get to see, as a faculty member, you get to see this growth, right? Over these 3 years, they come into their senior thesis, they have this culminating project that represents kind of their interpretation of their entirety of their learning, right? So it's really this this kind of capstone, I guess you could say it in some ways. It's this way of bringing together all they've learned, and it demonstrates the very specific skills that each discipline has taught them. But in an overarching sense, it's their ownership of their own education, right? These are projects that are developed independently with their thesis mentor. And I think for most of us, we use very much a model of mentorship similar to what you would see in graduate school, where students have developed an idea through consultation with their advisor. They refine and develop that idea to something that can frankly be done in 9 months, because it's not atypical for thesis students to come and show you a 20-year research program that they'd like to get done in a 9-month period. So part of our job is to kind of rein that in a little bit, what's possible to do in an 8 to 9 month project. But it is very much their own. So what we're working for them to do is not only kind of focus on the specificity of their own project, but show a depth of understanding of the literature around it. So in my field, many of us, we write research articles that are relatively short, and they outline a particular project. A thesis is not a research article. A thesis is the ability to show kind of the breadth of the area around your specific topic. And then it culminates in an oral exam. So certainly there's a document. In my department, 40 to 60 page APA-style research report. And then there's an hour-and-a-half oral defense. And in my department, that typically means 2 to 3 psychologists and someone from outside of the division who sits there. And part of the oral exam, our students are presenting their work to us, and we are asking them questions. And often the questions we are asking are the type of questions we would ask a colleague at a scientific meeting or in disciplinary meetings, where we're asking them to consider alternatives. We certainly ask questions about what did you learn from this process, what would you do differently, where would you go next? But that's why in many ways it is really a remarkable experience to be part of these oral exams, because you do get to see this ownership. And students quite often are terrified of the oral. So in my department, in my laboratory, we do mock orals, we practice. I know some parts of the college do this more or less, so they can, start to reduce that anxiety. But typically at the end, students really enjoy their oral because they are the expert. As much as we are the faculty mentor and support the project, we didn't do all those readings, right? We didn't formulate the thoughts in the paper. That's their work. And so I think the sense of accomplishment that they have is something that I think is, very unique to undergraduate institutions that have theses, because they're not. I was at a large research institution before I came. Theses were honors theses, and that typically was the PI handed you a project, and you did that project. That is not what happens here. So it's really, I think, a pretty wonderful and special experience.
And I would just add, in terms of nuts and bolts, the thesis counts as one class the entire year, senior year. And so it will take up the space of one class. So that's important to recognize, that when students are planning for their major, et cetera, they need to plan for their senior year being occupied with one unit each semester of the thesis. In rare cases, there are one-semester theses, but those are usually students who've had particular difficulty with the Qual or what have you. But the one thing that I think really helps students is for them to recognize that the time the thesis should take should also be approximately the amount of time you would spend on a class that you're really working hard on, right? So this would be a class where you would have, so if it's 3 hours a week, you would expect to be doing 9 hours of outside reading or something like that. And I think the more that students structure their time in that way and give themselves deadlines, as thesis advisor, I know we all encourage our students to give themselves deadlines to kind of create essentially a syllabus of sorts. What kind of reading do you want to do? What kind of research do you need to do? This is obviously going to be different, I assume, in anthropology, where there's also, and psychology actually, where they're designing a research project in the fall, and then the write-up is more in the spring. In humanities, it's much more you're doing a bunch of research, a lot of reading in the fall, and then writing in the spring. But a lot of this is kind of, executive planning, right? It's really thinking about what is the shape of this project, how do I make it fit into the time allotted, and how do I just break it down into small enough parts that I can actually get it done? By the time they're seniors, any Reed student can write a 5-page paper with their eyes closed. And so they need to realize that breaking it up into units of 5-page papers is what they're doing. And so this, as thesis advisors, this is what we help them to do, is to translate from these lofty, ambitious, truly off their rocker sometimes ideas that then become refined into really great things. And they really do produce amazing things, but our job is to help them kind of narrow that down.
Yeah, if I can just jump on that, I would just say, I tell my students all the time, it's like, I've done lots of research projects over the years. I will help you set up these goals, and they're mutually, well, some are set like a class. I do have a syllabus for thesis because I have a number of thesis students, but we have individualized goals. And I often tell them, at this point I've supervised 57 theses. I know just about how long it takes to do certain things. And so there are going to be times where we can negotiate a deadline. There are going to be times where it's non-negotiable. Because in my ideal sense, thesis should feel fairly steady, as Anna's saying. 10 hours a week is usually what I tell students. We talk a lot about time management. So as much as I'm giving content advice, a lot of it is just how do you, as Anna's saying, take a big project and do it in a reasonable way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, in addition to what everyone's already said, I'm always thrilled to read theses and realize, to sort of see students I've worked with over a couple of years, the ways that they've sort of engaged with and built upon and developed the ideas that we've been talking about. But it is a much more ambitious, at least in anthropology, I guess in every discipline, it's much more ambitious than anything any student has worked on until senior year. And it goes best, at least in anthropology, for students who've been sort of mulling over ideas in sophomore, junior year as well. They have something that an idea, a problem, a topic, a site that just fascinates them. And I see them coming to me and just kind of chatting about it in office hours, sometimes even as early as their first year. And you can see how it kind of builds over I know that this is not official read policy. You're not supposed to start the thesis too early and so on. But I find, at least in anthropology, it works. It's easiest and it's sort of most fulfilling for students who've been mulling over it and using their different classes to kind of attack the same problem over a couple of years.
Yeah, I would say it's different in psychology because students may work with someone who they've had a lot of classes with or somewhere they've had fewer classes with. So we tend to have students really develop that idea at the beginning of the fall because they can't really guarantee that, because we are a very specialized discipline. So, if you've been thinking about electrophysiology and you don't end up working with electrophysiologists. Yeah. So I think there are some variations across the college.
And I was just going to add that ad hoc interdisciplinary majors often do actually require you to think about the thesis a little bit earlier. So sometimes if you have to propose the major, which I guess we didn't talk too much about, but there are some majors where there is a major proposal. Comparative literature would be one example of that, where you have to propose the major, you get it approved by a committee, and part of that is starting to think about the thesis. So there's kind of, again, that's why we're speaking generally here, but in terms of your own students' particular experience, it's really crucial to read what an individual department advises and expects. Because in some cases there is this pre-planning, but in other cases, as Chris said, especially departments that are heavily impacted, where they're going to need to allocate different students to different research opportunities depending on who's available, et cetera. You won't necessarily work on exactly the project you intended, but then sometimes the serendipity of that, I hear, works out really, really well.
Yeah, and even in cases, often if a student's been working in the same laboratory, they're likely to work in the same laboratory, but we try to train students with the idea that you could learn a technique your senior year that maybe you didn't learn before because you became excited about the idea of doing it. So it's not the kind of thing that if you've never worked in behavioral neuroscience until your senior year, it's still possible to do that as a thesis. If you came in and said, hey, there's this idea I'm really interested in, and non-human animal models are really the way to test it, we'll try to do that if it can work.
So now we open it up to you. Any question is fair game. We've got years and years of experience here, and we're happy to try to answer anything. And we've got folks with microphones coming through, because I think this is being recorded, and this will allow it to show up in the recording. Marty is nodding his head. So we will wait till the microphone is coming from there.
Hello. My daughter is thinking of is dual majoring, so I gather this means she's going to write 2 theses, and she's going to live to tell the tale.
I can respond. I see those. Yes, it's if someone chooses to do a double major, I will say we often discourage it because it requires 2 qualifying exams and 2 theses. Students, I have seen 1 student do it in the same year successfully. I have seen more students in psychology do it this way, where they basically start one thesis in the fall, do spring, they have spring and fall, or spring, second semester of the first major, and first semester of the second major overlap, and they do an extra semester. It's physically possible. It's just very difficult to do. So if there's any possibility to do an interdisciplinary ad hoc, we'll try to do that because that gives them 2 quals, 1 thesis. But sometimes they're just mutually exclusive. You know, it's very hard. It's very hard to do psychology and physics together. It's very hard. The only student who I really think of who, in my memory, was highly successful doing both at the same time, did theater and psychology at the same time. But they are such different disciplines that they did their show in the fall, and then they did their research study in the spring. So they were still working a ton, but they weren't competing like the time requirements were competing. So, but if a student wants to do it and they have the capability, we will support them in making those decisions.
And I think
Yeah.
the other thing is minors are really a good option sometimes in that case, and that there are many of us, actually at Reed, I think more of us than normal, for instance, who have an undergraduate minor that became their focus in graduate school or something like that. That's certainly my case. And so I would say, you know, there's also the possibility of realizing that there's other paths. If you're looking for a credential, there's other paths to that kind of credential. And
No
thesis.
thesis.
There's no thesis for a minor.
Yeah, and that's one reason we actually developed the minors some years ago, was this idea that we had more and more students who wanted to do double majors or wanted to do ad hoc interdisciplinary. And sometimes it's just not a really good fit to put those 2 together. And so it's really opened the door, I think, for more and more students, because there's some depth to the training that's happening in the minors. We don't have a minor in my department, but I've been really impressed with the minors that my colleagues have developed. So it's not necessarily it's not like, oh yeah, I happen to take 4 classes in this. No, I mean, they're expecting, you know, significant preparation. So I think it's an option to look at.
Are the defenses open to the public or closed?
I mean, they're closed, but I'm just trying to think if someone asked.
Just for other majors or people who are
Yeah,
interested in the
no.
subject to listen to the defense?
No, it's not. I went to Carleton as an undergraduate, and they're all public defenses there, and there's none of that. But I think we have had special guests, certainly.
Yeah, you can invite guests.
But it's relatively unusual.
Hi, I just wanted to share that we have a senior who's working hard on her thesis right now, and she was told by her department to provide 3 ideas and 3 advisor choices, and then they were going to match her up, I suppose, on availability and fit too. So that's what she did, and she was happy that she got her first choice. So, but the way that she's organizing is by chapter, so that's kind of how she's making it digestible to do that. My question is, in terms of the timeline, are the oral exams and the deadline for completing the writing, are they like right up to 2 weeks before she should graduate? I'm just worried about her anxiety, or could she get it done earlier than that, just to make sure she's all done?
So deadlines, there's certain deadlines that they have to meet to have their oral exam. So the last day of classes, their thesis document is due. In fact, there's a huge celebration of that with the senior class. So it's really lovely when students are done on time because they get to be part of this big celebration. And then oral exams start the Monday after, in what normally would be their reading week. So typically it's that first week in May. Sometimes students I've had over the years, sometimes students who have gotten their document done a little early. We don't, I try to have my students that the meat and potatoes are really done and they're using that latter part of that month of April to clean it up. And there's mixed feelings about that. Some people are like, sure, I'll sign off on it now, then you can not worry about it. However, you also think you have 2 weeks where you could be making that prettier, and it goes to a committee who has to read it. And so I think mainly working with the advisor to set reasonable goals so the student feels pretty confident when they go in. And we have intermediary goals, like each division has a prelim draft due. Usually, I don't know, it switches, but it's about a month-ish before it's due. I think most of us are around that time.
I think everyone has a full draft of the thesis due
Like
a month prior
before.
to that deadline.
Right. So rarely are students like down to the wire tapping the last word. They're making it pretty. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and that draft deadline, it comes quite early, so that can be stressful in its own right. But I always tell my advisees that what they're submitting then is a full thesis that they could submit as their final. It wouldn't be as pretty as it will be eventually, but it does make that last month and a half of senior spring much more relaxed, I find.
And I will say that we don't just let them go and stew in their own juices. I mean, we do quite a bit, in my department to try to do things to support seniors through the thesis process. So there's some things that we do for the entirety of the senior class who's doing theses. But I have a lab. I typically have 4 to 6 thesis students each year. And so we have a lab-based model. So they're working on their individual projects. But in addition to our individual meetings, we meet as a group. And I really use that time to try to help the students have a sense of community and a sense of social support. And I very explicitly had at thesis meeting this week, our lab meeting, we talked about these are the dark days of November, right? This is this period where we're heading from fall break into Thanksgiving. How do we keep our motivation, right? How do we encourage each other? So we talked about different strategies, right? So to some extent, I think as mentors, we're also trying to be their anxiety is salient. And it is not unusual for me in April to assign my students what they have to do between now and next thesis meeting is to go to a movie, go out with their friends, go for a walk. I'm very much attuned to the fact that these are whole people. They're not just little brains in jars. Yeah.
So I have thank you very much for going through the whole academic journey and development. Very great descriptions. So I want like you to comment on the aspect of what are you going to do with it. So I imagine there's different scenarios. I mean, students, some of them are ready, they're being snatched, like our daughter has a job and they want to keep her. There's graduate school. I want to take a year off. So I wonder if you could comment about those types of scenarios and how they can keep involved and certainly draw from their experience here, get letters, practical things, get letters of recommendation or anything to bridge them into that next step.
Well, I can start a little bit. That I think generally our approach is similar to what we were talking about in terms of choosing a major, having multiple options before you. Certainly in the humanities, we've had colossal success getting students into graduate programs, but in 2022, there is a point at which the job market for professors is pretty rough right now, and so it's often hard to get a job. So while we have had tremendous success with graduate school, we certainly do encourage our students to look at a variety of options. And in humanities, at least, that can mean looking at internships. It can mean looking at graduate programs, but it can also mean just looking at trying to get a job. And one student, I think, who was enormously successful, for instance, applied to law school, applied to graduate schools, and applied to Oregon Public Broadcasting. And I think that was for him a really good path. Is a producer at Weekend Edition. So it all worked out really well, but it also he was open to all of these different possibilities. So one thing I would also add is, because I have kids at large universities, we know our students. The letters of recommendation we write are so much more detailed. And so really, in terms of any kind of anything that they're applying for where they need a letter of recommendation, I think they really are at a considerable advantage being somewhere where we know them and we know them well. This is very hard at the large universities to find more than one faculty member with whom you've worked. And so I think I would just put in a plug for that as well, that, I think they should explore multiple possibility. Reed students are generally incredibly talented and can do any number of things. It is very hard in humanities. I assume this is true in your disciplines as well, that they have this dream of going to graduate school and becoming a professor, et cetera, which I think is a wonderful dream, but we do have to tell them that you have to have other options as well right now, just because the academic job market is pretty ugly. But that doesn't mean that they don't go on to do that, and so we have bunches of students teaching at bunches of places, so I don't mean to be absolutely negative about that, but I think in today's job market, as I think most of you probably know better than we do as well, you really have to have multiple possible paths before you.
No, I think that.
Okay. I will say, sadly, as a clinical psychologist, I am currently in a growth industry. So my students, if they want to go my path, probably have lots of job options. But for my area, I will say, I don't necessarily think of my job to put out a bunch of mini-me's, right? I've certainly had students over the years who've pursued graduate work in clinical psychology and become faculty. But really, kind of the best part of being at this institution and teaching undergraduates is I have this lovely array of students who've gone on to do really interesting and different things. So yes, I have a lot of social workers. I've had a lot of students who are marriage and family therapists. I have students who are teachers. I have students who've worked at Twitter and Google and all of these different things. So, it's not just that our job here is to kind of recreate ourselves. So we do programming in the departments about careers. We have panels where we invite our alumni back who've not only done what we do, but do lots of different things, and to try to expand their horizons of the different types of options out there. Or students yes, I did what I thought I wanted to do. I went and got a degree in, a PhD in psychology. I did that, and I realized my passion was in social justice, so I switched. Because I think it's important for students to understand that the world has changed. It's no longer you get a degree and you get this job and you're there, right? My career path, I've had a lot of different jobs before this one. It wasn't just that I was a dilettante. I just had interests, and for part of my youth, I wanted to be a political activist, and I did that. And then I taught special education, and then I got my PhD, and I do this. So for me, I'm trying to kind of debunk the notion that there's this one singular path. Because you can have your passion for a decade, and the lovely thing I think about a Reed and a liberal arts education, is that we actually do train students to have that ability to pivot, right? And so that they can pivot in 10 years if they're like, this was awesome for 10 years, and I want to do something different.
Probably one of our last questions.
So my question's around the qualifying exams. You spoke a lot about how the qualifying exams are basically to make sure that they're ready for their thesis. So I have two questions. One, does that mean the qualifying exams are unique to each individual student, or are they, one exam for the major itself? And then my second question being, with a student who decides to study abroad, you mentioned study abroad during the spring semester. Does that mean fall semesters out of the question? How onerous is it for a student to study abroad and complete their qualifying exams, practically speaking?
I'll just answer that second question first. It's no problem to go abroad either semester in your junior year. Well, actually, there I should say there are some departments where there are classes you have to take one semester or another. So again, that's got to be planned with the major advisor. But in terms of the so your students can't take the qualifying exam abroad?
Typically, our students go abroad because of the preparation for the scientific work. Typically, our students go abroad second semester of the sophomore year, first semester of the junior year, and then sit for Qual in the spring. It is possible for someone to go abroad second semester of the junior year. We have not yet done a remote. We're talking about that. The problem is for us is it's really hard to be abroad that second semester of the junior year and then be able to jump in the laboratory in the fall. It's sort of you're out of sync. It's difficult.
I think the main message is that planning really helps. We do a lot of planning, and I do a lot of this, especially being in a French department, planning with students, looking at their 4-year plan, including things like psychology or whatever, saying what would be the best semester for you to go abroad. But then just to quickly answer your first question, the qualifying exam is going to depend. There are departments where it's the same exam for all students. But for instance, in humanities, well, not all humanities departments, but in Comp Lit and French, for instance, we write a different exam for each student because we can do that. There aren't that many majors, and so it's a feasible thing. The Comp Lit students, we get enormously grateful feedback from them because they just love it, that they've written this proposal and then someone took it seriously enough to write an exam about it. But I don't know how sustainable that is because Comp Lit is becoming a more popular major. So we've got to figure out ways to do all of that. But for the most part, I would say most majors, it is one exam per major.
Yeah, I mean, in anthropology, it's one exam per major, but one question on the exam is always asking them to think about their thesis and often to sort of map out, based upon the questions that they've been thinking about throughout the rest of the qualifying exam, a potential thesis topic, which for many students is the first time that they've been forced to really think through methodologies and questions and sites. And I know in quite a few cases that ends up being their thesis topic. So it does. So it's specified in that sense that they get to think about their thesis topic, but it's the same question for everyone.
This is fascinating because I don't know what everybody's quals are like. So in psychology, we have the structure of the qual is the same, but you have 7 research abstracts to pick from. So the students have agency to pick an article from an area, and we encourage them, please pick an article from an area you've taken classes in where you have some expertise. But then students get to pick. And so then we, because of our size, we're now making them pick multiple, like the 3 major and 3 faculty. Now it's pick 3 or 2, and then we'll assign you 1. But for the most part, we do still allow that individualization because students have taken different pathways through the major.
And I will say it's very different across the majors. I believe in history, and I know in comparative race and ethnicity studies, the qualifying exam is just folded into a junior seminar. So the qualifying exam is completing the class, and there's no,
Yeah, and so I think we'll echo the message, and I think we're done with this, but just reading the details of each specific major, and that what this session should teach you is that there's more reading to do. But all the information is available, but also the people are available. So your students should please feel free to talk to any of us in a major that they're contemplating, or even one that they're not, if they want help deciding between things. Often humanities 110 professors are in that role, and I know I've talked to a lot of students about, what are you really thinking? Because we get to see them right when they come in to read. So we're more than happy to talk to your students, and so please do send them our way. And we hope you have a really wonderful rest of your parents' weekend, and that your kids get all the, I don't know, they were telling me they want food and clean showers. In class yesterday, some were saying we were going to go to our parents' hotel room and shower. So, I don't quite understand that, but just make sure you make that available to them. So have a great rest of your parents' weekend.